have a few people talking in the background and making like comments about what's going on.
Well, I don't know that. Unless does Peter want to he can enter things in on the keyboard. I'm sure that.
Although I am hoping for more folks, let me encourage some of you to come a little closer here. It seems a little distant. So perhaps a few rows at least in this direction. And there are agendas in the back when you came in the door, so if you didn't grab one, you might want to just get one now as you're coming up to the front. We are being recorded live on MCAT tonight, which is why these microphones are going to be very interesting. I've been told we all need to be speaking in these so that folks can hear us that are watching on MCAT. So again, I'm glad to see you, and if you could just kind of move up a little bit, we're going to be starting in just a couple of minutes. Okay, I think we'll try to get started. My name is Judy Smith. I'm with the new party, and I welcome you here and glad to see you tonight. We're really beginning a discussion of, I think, a very important community question, which is how we integrate concerns about affordable housing and open space. And as we start to do that, I certainly want to acknowledge that there's been lots of efforts already going on discussing some of these topics. Certainly there are groups going on in our community now discussing open space. There's a growing number of organizations that are concerned about affordable housing and some of the problems that people who can't find affordable housing are having here in our community. And there are certainly neighborhood associations who every day struggle with this question of how do we respond to the demand for affordable housing and still protect our open space. So certainly this isn't a unique discussion, but it's one that we feel the new party has a particular role to play in that we'd like to explain a bit to you tonight and then ask again for your involvement as we go through a process. I see a couple more folks coming in. Maybe we'll pause just for a moment because we are going to try to be fairly participatory in this discussion right from the start. There's some agendas right there at the door if you'd like to pick those up. We're just getting started. Last spring, we started a Missoula chapter of the new party, basically committed to the idea that a group of people could really make a difference in the democratic process here by making it more accountable and more participatory. and also with the idea of building a third party to be a political force that would actually move the community in that direction of a more participatory political process. So as we started, we were really looking at a basic agenda which includes things such as human rights and things like economic fairness and things like environmental responsibility, but believing that all of those have to work together, that it's not possible to have one without the other. In order to have a community that we were particularly interested in living in, we were looking at an integrated agenda that would be something that we would all be working together to create and then to implement, but looking at all of our issues coming together. And with that in mind, when we screened candidates during the last spring, we screened them and asked them specifically for their support on all of these issues. We were not interested in endorsing a candidate just on their open space interests, just on their affordable housing interests, just on their human right interests, but basically how those interests all came together, how they could be integrated into a common agenda that we could all work toward. And in some ways, that's why we're here tonight, our commitment to that idea of an integration of these various issues. The new party has a working group called the Affordable Housing Open Space Working Group. And it's really the mission of that particular working group to come up with some kind of program, process, to link those two issues together and to bring them to the political decision makers in our community. It's our desire to talk in detail about the linkages and to come up with some way that we can actually make something like that happen. So although we're discussing tonight, our commitment is not just discussion. Our commitment is a political process. Our commitment is whatever we need to do as a political party, as people very concerned about this community, to make sure that this kind of integration of issues, this kind of program actually occurs in Missoula. And so this meeting tonight in some ways is a first step. Those of us that will be presenting some of this first information to you are members of the new party. We do not come here as experts on these topics. We come here as committed citizens who have been involved in various parts of this discussion. We come here knowing there are no easy answers. We come here knowing that while we have some ideas, we certainly don't have all of the ideas. And as I say, this is a starting point for us to begin to put our ideas on the table, to ask people for their ideas, and to move forward in developing a program that we will be presenting to the whole community. So with that in mind, I'd like to review the agenda with you. If you didn't get one, there's still a few over on the table. You'll see that what our plan is for the evening is first to do some introductions, and part of that introduction is going to be asking you, right off the bat, what is something that you really feel needs to be put on the table when we talk about integrating open space and affordable housing. After we do those introductions, we're going to take some time to give you a framework from those of us who are on the working group of the new party that is talking about affordable housing and open space. And then we're going to be walking through some very basic concerns that we have identified from our discussions in the groups that we're a part of throughout the community and among ourselves. At that time, we will then be open for questions and comments from anyone here. And by the time that concludes, we'll be talking about what are the next steps that we see to take this discussion further into building a program. I didn't put exact times on the agenda because this meeting in some ways is an experiment. We haven't done it before. I'm not quite sure how long each part is going to take. We're hoping that you all came because you have a particular interest in this kind of discussion. We're hoping for time for you to be able to be involved in telling us what that interest is. And then we're hoping to be done around 9 o'clock. And when we are, we have some coffee and various kinds of cookies outside. We encourage you to stay. And we also have some literature at the back table. And by the end, we're going to encourage you that if you're interested in what we're talking about, to consider becoming a member of the new party, because certainly we'd like to have more of you do that if that's your interest. So with that in mind, we're going to do this introduction, and we'll try it out and see how we do it with passing a microphone around so the folks at home can actually hear what we're saying here. So we'd like each person to say their name and to say at least one thing that they'd like to see really talked about when we talk about integrating open space and affordable housing. We're going to write those things down. We're basically going to create a record of this discussion to take with us into building the kind of program that we want to propose for the community. So with that in mind, I've asked Lynn to walk around with the microphone and ask folks again to say their name and the particular issue they'd like to bring up right away. And Howard and I are going to be getting these onto the paper up here in the front.
My name's Dave Parker, and I'm a candidate for the State House of Representatives in House District 65. And my interest is in affordable housing, and I guess in the basic idea of how we do integrate those between the need for affordable housing, which we clearly need, and also the preservation of open space.
I'm Paul Houston. I live Min Lane, and my interest is in cooperative housing. I like to see some more cooperative housing interest in the city. And I think if we have some cooperative housing, we'll begin to make a dent into the homelessness.
I'm Elizabeth Husted, and I'm a volunteer at the food bank, and I see certainly the need for housing that people can afford, both cooperative and affordable.
My name's Pam Dietrich. I'm interested in making sure that there's not too much development so as to ensure good quality of life, and at the same time to provide housing for lower income people.
I'm Perry Gleesman. One of my interests is in how we can go about rebuilding, renovating housing that's no longer being used but could be again.
My name is Jeff Badnock. I'm interested in seeing how the city can work to develop a workable infill strategy so that where density should occur, it does occur, and that we don't have to keep spilling out into the valley in order to house the people who need to live here, who want to live here.
Hi, my name is Andy Sponseller. I represent Save Open Space, and in as much as our organization is real concerned about urban open space, I think we're just as interested in a livable, progressive community that supports a diverse group of people.
Elena Ingram, I'm here to hear what you have to say as a new party, and other issues.
I'm Richard Gottschalk. I'm currently chairman of the Open Space Committee for the city. I have presidency of the Neighborhood Network, so I'm involved in both respects with open space and housing. I'm really concerned about how this community develops on the large scale kind of urban design that we end up with that succeeds in integrating an open space system that extends throughout the urban area and residential areas to accommodate people of all levels of income in a way that these two fit together.
My name is Tim Hall. I'm a rural planner. I work for Missoula County, and I'm interested in learning what people in the group think about breaking down certain barriers in neighborhoods and areas, both rural and urban, through creative design and site planning, and allowing open space and affordable housing to simultaneously occur.
Hello, Donald Scott, and I'm interested in housing for the elderly, which about 50% of us at least are going to be sometime down the line. I'm interested in not-for-profit nursing home care and part-time group home care.
I'm Bill Carey. I'm also interested in a limited equity housing cooperative on an infill site, one that would be accepted by neighbors as a resident-owned and well-designed project.
I'm Terry Rice, and I'm interested in the proper sewage disposal and where the money's coming from and by who.
I'm Terry LaCour. I'm president of the Rattlesnake Homeowners Association, as well as candidate for House District 69. I'm here to voice my concerns on affordable infrastructure, how it impacts both of those issues.
I'm Helen Chipolato, and I'm a longtime resident. I'm just interested in what was going to happen here tonight.
I'm Michael Regner with the New Party, Summit Independent Living Center, and the Coalition of Montanans Concerned with Disabilities. I'm interested in figuring out some way how people who live in Missoula can actually afford to buy houses here, live here. And I'm also interested in this type of accessible, or housing that's accessible to people with disabilities.
I'm Will Snodgrass, and I am interested in seeing that affordable housing is built out of non-toxic material. Some of the glue-up homes that are being built to service the affordable housing realm are actually making people sick. I think we have to take a very close look at that. I talked with some individuals this afternoon. Problem. Thank you.
I'm John Fletcher. I attended last Tuesday's meeting of the Planning Board. There was quite a spirited discussion there. Anyway, the Planning Board was trying to deal with some of these issues. We were talking about a subdivision, what to do with the parkland that was being offered by the developer, how our park department didn't really have the money to develop a park if it were dedicated there. We were talking about the actual cost of the homes that were being built or to be built on the site, and we weren't coming to any resolution there, and so I'd certainly be interested in hearing what folks possibly can come up with tonight.
I'm Mary Bouchard, and I'm with NPA and the New Party, and I would like to discuss something on making mobile home parks and also maybe mobile home land more affordable and more accessible. Thank you.
I'm Anne Mary Dusso, Missoula County Commissioner, and I'm interested in seeing how we can resolve the apparent conflict between these two issues, and I am of the firm belief that there does not have to be a conflict, that there are a number of approaches that we can use, and particularly as the city and county move into growth management strategies, that the discussion tonight should be very helpful.
I'm Terry Kendrick. I'm a member of the New Party, and I work with WORD, the Women's Opportunity and Resource Development Center. And I, too, am here to see how we can have both open space and affordable housing.
I'm Rebecca Huntington, and I'm a journalism student at the University of Montana, interested in open space and housing issues.
Hello, my name is Joe Halderson. Before I tell you why I'm here tonight, I want to thank you for making this meeting possible. I thank you because I am a concerned citizen, and I appreciate what other concerned citizens are doing in Missoula to make things better. As an engineer, I have learned how certain projects can have serious effects and negative impact on the environment. I have also learned firsthand how some projects, especially those funneled by federal grant money, can be used to push development, erode open space, and steal from the taxpayers. Also, as an engineer, I know that sewer is needed in certain areas, but I also know from firsthand experience that expensive projects such as sewering in Missoula are being used to push development of valuable open space. At the same time, certain individuals and engineers and construction firms have profited illegally through violations of federal law and through bid rigging. How do I know this? I know this because I have been investigating this area for over 20 years. I am a federal whistleblower. Okay. When sewer projects are used to push development of open space, Missoula is the loser. And when expensive sewer projects are laid down under areas needing affordable housing, the housing is no longer so affordable. I believe there are certain individuals in Missoula who are profiteering from Seward and the related development it brings. And as a result, the Missoula Valley is not being protected. It is being stolen right up from and under our noses. Sewer lines are the creeping fingers of the developers. The big questions are, how long are these fingers? How big is Missoula sewer fraud? Can the taxpayer afford to pay this? And what is happening to our valley? Okay. Okay.
Yes, my name is John Rice. I'm a native Missoulian. I'm also the regional coordinator for Montanans for Better Government, and I also am very much concerned about the sewering here in Missoula and the problems as far as density.
I'm Elsie Anderson, and I'm interested to see how housing, affordable housing for the lowest of the low income and the homeless will fit into this with affordable housing and open space. I'm Mary Bigbow, and also the new party has been doing some great work, and I would like to see some interest in people joining the new party.
I'm Holly Schroeder, and I'd like to see an end to urban sprawl in Missoula.
I'm Kirsten Richard, and I'm interested in the housing issues.
I'm Linda Tracy, and I will be speaking later, so I'll hold comment for a moment.
I'm Elaine Schaaf, and I represent Ward 1 in the Rattlesnake. I'm very interested in making sure everybody has a safe and decent place to live. I think that's really just basic need in Missoula, and that situation does not really exist now because there's so few vacancy rates and places that people can afford to live. I really think that affordable housing and open space can exist in a peaceful fashion, and people are the resource that can be used in a collaborative way to make sure that we resolve and plan and use growth management tools in order to do that. And I see that this kind of forum is really a positive and a hopeful kind of beginning to do that without the politics that sometimes gets in the way. I particularly like clustered home sites and clustered housing, cooperative housing, home share, more creative ways to fit people in urban areas as well as retain the beauty that surrounds us here in the area.
I'm Cornelius Inderlin, and I'm here on the sewer
project and considering about the funding of the sewer system?
I'm Bob McKelvey. I'm the chairman of the citizens group that is working to pass the open space bond issue. And I'm perplexed when I hear people say that buying open space land means that we're freezing the housing for people in Missoula Valley. I don't think the scale of what we're proposing to do is so enormous with the kind of money that we can get to do much more than to try to play catch up with the fact that we haven't developed any parks in this valley for a good long time now. And furthermore, most of the parks are going to be in areas like floodplains along the rivers and up on the sides of the mountain. It seems to me that the same people who are most in need of affordable housing are the people for whom it is most important that they have the possibility of getting out into public parkland. And so I'm perplexed as to how to answer this question that's raised. To me, there really isn't a conflict between an open space program and taking care of the housing needs of all of our people.
Well, thank you. Again, it helps us realize the range of interests here and the variety of probably potential opinions in the room, which could be interesting. What we're going to do is basically present some information now from those of us in the working group with the new party. I'm going to talk some about the affordable housing situation. Bill Clark's going to talk some about the open space situation. And what we're going to try to do is to give you kind of an overview, a framework as we see it as to what's been happening with these questions and basically where we might be now here in Missoula. And from there, we're going to then, as I mentioned, talk about a few of the very specific concerns that we've identified. So in your mind, just again, you may or may not agree with us. We're going to have a chance for you to bring up your comments and concerns when we're done. Please save those, and as we have the time, we'll certainly respond to those. But we are trying to get some common information here in the room. We're going to try to tell you from our perspective kind of where things are, what we're hearing in this discussion of affordable housing and open space. And maybe as some of we are saying, there is no conflict, maybe it's a perception, but one of the things that certainly is in the community that I listen to is that perception of that there are two questions here instead of one question. And hopefully we can come to an understanding of how we can make it one question of how we do both of these things in the best possible way for the community. So let me start out here on this discussion of affordable housing. And again, I'm not saying I'm here as the absolute expert on this topic. There's probably here people in the room who have more specific information and experience with it than I do. But I'm here as someone who's participated in a great deal of the discussion and have some particular thoughts about where we are and why we're here. First of all, I think it's really very obvious to any of us who've lived in Missoula for a while that affordable housing is a major question. I would say there's two ways I know that. Everyone I know either has an increase in their rents, an increase in their property tax, or can't find a place to live. And I talk to lots of folks, and believe me, everybody kind of falls in those general parameters. And the other one is, when anyone calls a $90,000 house affordable, something is very wrong. So those to me are all the evidence I need to say that there's a problem. In fact, I would believe there's a crisis because I work with folks who often are the ones who can't find any place to live. And so from their perspective, it is very much a crisis that for a two-bedroom apartment, the average rent is over $500 a month now. And the homes on the market, if you look around you at all, there's very little that is under that $90,000 amount that I just mentioned. So for them, there is no real opportunity to, even with the new program that's supposed to help limited income people buy houses, that program isn't able to provide enough assistance for them to actually move in and buy something. So from my view, I don't think there's much question that we have a crisis in affordable housing. More to the point is, why did we get here, and what is it that we might be able to do about it? So let me just venture a few suggestions as why we got here, and again, they're not going to be greatly elaborated, they're going to be very quick. One of them is we didn't do a lot of building of the kind of housing stock we might have wanted to have in the 80s. There was minimal building going on. There didn't seem to be a perception of crisis. Most of the people I know, even the low-income people that I worked with in the 80s, did not see things as a crisis. They were able to find a place to live. Maybe it wasn't the best place. Maybe it still took a significant amount of their income, but they were still able to find a place to live. It was only toward the very end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s that the people that I work with would come into my office and say, there's no place for me to live. My AFDC benefit rate can't even cover the cost of a rent of an apartment. I would have no money left over whatsoever if I had to go out and try to find an apartment for my families. I had people who would move here and absolutely not be able to find a house to live in. That started in the 90s and has escalated so that one of the projects of my organization over at Word right now knows that there are at least 200 families that are homeless in Missoula on any given day. And so basically what we have is a situation where we have not had the kind of building that have allowed people then to have a place to live. So that's one thing. Until very recently, and even now I would argue, we haven't had the kind of housing stock building that would have been important. The second thing is the basic change in the economy. And again, most of you I'm sure are very familiar with this. People in Missoula have less money. The jobs have changed. The kind of incomes that people are making, often we're working in service sector jobs. Often we're bringing home minimum wage jobs, minimum wage incomes. So again, someone who could be working full-time would still not have the money to be able to afford the kinds of rents that we were talking about, to buy the kind of houses. So the restructuring of the economy has meant that our particular community has a larger number of people now than before who absolutely don't have the economic resources to be able to pay for the cost of their housing. And it would be very interesting to know really how many Missoulians today pay more than what HUD considers appropriate of their income for their housing. And what HUD says is 30% of your income is what would be considered the amount you should be spending for housing. And I don't know about you in the room. You may not be typical, or you may, but how many of you spend more than 30% of your income for housing? Most folks in Missoula now that I work with spend anywhere from 50 to 100% of their income on their housing. Again, because of a restructuring in the economy and the folks who live here, the economic resources that they don't have anymore. The third factor is in-migration. And that's gone on exactly at the same time that we've had some of these other problems going on. Some of these folks are the folks we all hear about who sell that fabulous property in California and make all that money and move here and build that sprawl house out there in the canyon where they never should have been living in the first place. But that's only part of them. A significant number come, people I often see in my office, who don't have economic resources but heard there might be a job here. They bring their families, they uproot them from somewhere else, they move in looking for anything possible. Those folks come in, they don't have an idea where they might live, they just think they can find something once they get here. There's been significant migration of those kinds of people, and we haven't really documented that as well as we have documented the folks who come in and build those upper-end homes. And the other kind of in-migration we've had is the university. And this is not to blame the university. This is simply to say that their number of students increased over a time when they didn't build any buildings to house those students. And so with all of that kind of growth in our population, it comes at a time when we haven't had housing building going on to absorb it. And the fourth factor, I would say, something that again compounds the problem, is just the cost in general to build houses. Because land has become more and more costly, because prices have gone up in building materials and labor, just to build anything right now costs more than it used to. So those factors together make it much more difficult for anyone, even if they desire to build lower cost housing, to do so. And the way I really, really know this is my organization is a nonprofit, is trying to build some affordable housing. And the cost that is coming out of our little, when we do the formula for everything and what it's going to cost and do, it is almost incredibly difficult to make anything for people that make less than what would be considered 50% of median income. We're struggling very hard to do that, and we're a nonprofit where we're going to get a lot of that money, if not given to us, at least at a very reasonable interest rate. So just the prices of everything have come together to make it very, very difficult to build affordable housing. Okay, so there's where we are. We're in a crisis. There's a number of things that have brought us to this crisis. What are we doing about it? Well, one of the positive things I think about living in Missoula is a number of people definitely have acknowledged that there's a problem here. A number of people have come together, and certainly some of the people in this room have done a lot of work to say we have to identify the problem, we've gathered a lot of statistics, and now we have to try to do something about it. So what is it that we do? Well, it's pretty obvious there's two things that need to happen in my mind. One is we have to build more. And the way to build more that it's actually affordable, it becomes a real question. How do we build more when there's very limited land? again, as the materials are too high, how do we get the cost of building down? So one of the things I think we have to do is promote, again, nonprofit development. And one of the reasons that's important is that that cost then is taken out of what someone has to pay in rent or someone has to pay to buy. If the land is donated, if the materials are cheaper, if the mortgage is only 1% money, then the cost of the overall project is low enough that perhaps some more low-income folks can live in those particular households. So one thing is, how do we get development to happen at a cheaper rate? And every possible way should be explored to do that. The other one is to really look at how we use our existing stock better, and several of you mentioned this already tonight. What are some of the policies that are out there that could make a difference? What could we do that is going to help us look at different kinds of housing practices? So I'll just run through some very quickly that are already being discussed here in Missoula, things that I personally think are very important to consider. One of them is the manufactured home question that was raised earlier. How can we use manufactured homes in a more effective way to meet the housing crisis? Manufactured homes have changed. They're no longer the trailers of, at least my childhood, we were raised to certainly not want to live around those people in trailers. It was a stereotype about what a trailer was and who lived in trailers. And we certainly need to get beyond that. If you look at some of the new manufactured homes, they're certainly much nicer than many of the places I've lived in, single-family homes and stick-built homes. And so we need to take a look at manufactured homes in a new way and to welcome them instead of shunning them, because they actually can make something much more affordable available for someone in our neighborhoods. So that's one thing, looking at those kinds of possibilities. Now here's one that everyone might not agree with me, but it's one we're processing right now in Missoula, which is I think we also have to get rid of the family definition in zoning, because I think that really also limits who can live and how many people in certain houses and what kinds of people can share housing, so we can't do home share and some of those other programs. And by the way, the new party does have a position that's on the back table saying that we really support the removal of that particular zoning approach. We do support some others that might deal with the legitimate complaints that are there within that. So those are several kinds of policies that I'm concerned about. Certainly there's some other things we can do about zoning and the kinds of codes, and someone mentioned some of the questions that we have when we look at densities and site specifications. Those are all important too if they move us in the direction we want to go. But I want to end this little piece with what I think is the most important thing. I think we have to develop political will. And that's one of the hardest things, I think, to develop, because we can come up with all of the techniques we want to, and we can talk about how we can change zoning in various ways or do different kinds of things. But until as a community we have political will to say every single neighborhood should have affordable housing. It shouldn't just be in multifamily ghettos like it is we are doing right now. That it shouldn't just be the north side and over on Russell around where I play soccer at Playfair that has all of these homes that just mushroom up. That it has to be something that every part of the community gets involved in. And neighborhood associations, you know, this is a challenge to them as well as to anyone else, because I'm a member of a neighborhood association. And we have to be able to understand that we need to make choices as neighborhoods, but we also have a responsibility to be part of the community. So how do we come up with a system that actually, in my opinion, is sort of like an allocation system? So that if you do housing projects, you have to really allocate them around so that every neighborhood has a part of what is needed to make affordable housing work. And by the way, I would also argue that every neighborhood should have a part of the open space that we need. And that might be one way to link these two issues, is to talk about allocation in a way where people who live in certain neighborhoods have a certain amount of say, but basically each neighborhood then is participating as part of the community. So again, that's an overview from my perspective that I bring this meeting of where we are with affordable housing, some of the things that we're now considering, and then possibilities for the future, which hopefully we'll all get a chance to talk about. So now I'm going to ask Bill if he'll try open space.
The first question is, what is open space? A friend of mine that works for the group Save Open Space was going around to businesses in town trying to get permission to put up a poster advocating Save Open Space. He went to this one place and went up to this employee and asked about putting up the poster, and the guy kind of snorted and said, "Open space? You've got all the damn open space you want out in eastern Montana." So it's possible to have quite a misconception of what open space is as well as what it does for the community. If you think that open space in eastern Montana is really as much good to us here, then you think that the fellow having the steak at the table next to you is as good as you're having the steak. What types of open space are there? What are we really talking about? Agricultural land at the urban fringe is an important type of open space. Vistas and views that are created or preserved, whether by keeping hillsides or creeksides undeveloped, or by siting and designing buildings, streets, and parking lots, so in the words of Dick Gottschalk, We are not hemmed in by tall buildings that dwarf us and cut us off visually from the larger surroundings. Parks of all sorts, from active parks to passive parks, where all you do is sit around and watch the river go by or have a picnic. Natural areas where human use is subordinated to allowing a place for nature in the midst of the urban area. Mixtures of buildings and landscaped areas, such as within subdivisions or commercial areas that can provide attractive and accessible green spaces. Trails and corridors, boulevards like Pine Street, small or landscaped green areas, community gardens, and most important for some of these, access to these areas. If all we end up with is a situation where we have spaces which we can look at but can't touch, it's a difficult situation for the community as well. Is open space important to our community? Some recent letter writers who've been complaining about the Save the Fort effort have said that concern for open space makes it impossible for housing providers to even attempt to meet the needs of a home-starved community. Another such letter argued that our civic duty is to provide housing so that generations of families can stay in the community. But arguments like these are based on ignoring what open space does for the community. They're like arguments made years ago when it was said that we can't afford to care for the environment because our first priority must always be for the economy. But ignoring the environment turned out to be a mistake. Doing so caught up with us, and then we had to apply the very expensive pound to cure instead of the much cheaper ounce of prevention. Furthermore, caring for the environment turned out to be an economic boon in its own right, in everything from pollution control equipment to better utilization of resources to creating or maintaining places where people desired to live and work. And that's what open space is. Open space is just another way of caring for our environment, and in this case, it's a way of caring for our urban environment. Whether we're talking about the economy or the environment or open space and affordable housing, we simply have to move forward on both at the same time. To see them as opposed is a false dilemma. We could no more ignore one of them than we could get by on just food without water. The visions we need before us here are what some people have termed sane cities or green cities or sustainable cities. These visions ask, for instance, how do we create cities of greater and greater urbanization which have less violence, which is an important concern for so many people. These visions stress that any housing, including affordable housing, must mesh with the open space and with other beings besides humans. Such care for the environment in the midst of a city helps diffuse the tensions between people that can result from an overly urban environment. It's as one person put it, it's the number of human contacts a day that are stressful, whether they're pleasant or unpleasant. It's just all the contacts that are stressful. What particular benefits does open space provide? Diverse, readily accessible, and often free recreational opportunities which do not require motorized travel outside the urban area. Places for privacy, contemplation, enjoyment, and relief from and perspective on the busyness and pressures of urban life. Visual, aesthetic, and inspirational enhancement and contribution to our quality of life and our way of thinking. Retention of our touch with nature, facilitating plants and wildlife coming into the urban area. I think this is most important, the idea of humans living in balance with nature. Open space helps offset our American tendencies to utter commercialization or dominating everything, including nature, by wholly using it up. And lastly, and this is no small advantage, open space is often located in such ways that it helps with flood control, abatement of erosion, pollution, and noise. A quick way to see, even in Missoula now, what open space has done for this community is to think of what we got from the last conservation bond, which was passed in 1980. The Riverfront Trails and Parks System, the Kim Williams Trail, the face of Mount Sentinel, much of the John Toole Park, which is the area that's located just west and south of the Madison Street Bridge, and elk habitat on Mount Jumbo. Now, this was only a $500,000 bond that was able to do all of this, and of course prices have gone up a lot now, and so we're talking about an $8 million bond for the whole county. But when you look at what's happened, it's not an unreasonable amount of money. And when you consider what Missoula right now would be without places like I've just mentioned, I think you can see what open space brings to the community. There's just a couple of issues I'd like to touch on in conclusion. Open space requires foresight to imagine what types of open space will most matter to the community in the future. And of course, here's another case where an ounce of early acquisition is worth a pound or a ton of efforts of later acquisition. And most often, open space that's gone is simply gone forever. Something like reclaiming the area where the John Toole Park was is more unusual. Second, do we get enough open space through our 1/9 park dedication requirement? In subdivision law, when a developer develops, he has to provide based upon the size of the development, he has to provide a certain amount of parkland as part of that. I don't think that such parcels are enough as open space. While they're important to the individual subdivisions for breaking up the seas of urban development around them, they are often unconnected to other open spaces, and they are just generally not significant enough to be really significant for the community. Such parcels are often marginal land as well, which have no real human use, although they are important as areas of small habitat for small mammals. Finally, developers often say that they don't want to provide any of the land at all, and so they provide what's called cash in lieu. The cash is based on you take the entire parcel of the land and you appraise it, and you give 1/9 of that cash of what it would be worth in its undeveloped state into the Parks and Rec Department. There's no guarantee that that land that money will purchase parkland, which is in any place located close to the development, or that it will be used to develop existing parkland anywhere near that area. Don't we already have lots of open space around us? That's a question I hear a lot. I was on the planning board in 1985, I think it was. I can't remember exactly. And I was amazed at that time to discover how much open land all around Missoula had already been subdivided and was just waiting to go into development. I mean, there's not nearly as much around you as you see that's open. Plus, an awful lot of this land, even if it's not going to be developed, is losing its public access. So essentially, we're being shut out of it anyway. Do we need more recreational open space if we have the Rattlesnake National Recreation Area? Yes. The rattlesnake is utterly unique and a priceless resource for this community, but it's only one type of open space experience that is not particularly accessible to most residents without a lot of driving. And the point is to have quality open space which is accessible to everybody in all places around the city. Also, I just would mention, this is a personal thing, so I probably shouldn't even say this, but does Fort Missoula have any unique open space values? I think it does. In the first place, it is, or rather was, already in public ownership. It is or was the last remaining and largest publicly zoned area in Missoula. Both of these attributes make or made it both cheaper and easier to acquire for open space than it would be to acquire private land, which may already be zoned for development and will therefore be much higher priced. In addition, given the directions which Missoula is most likely to develop, Fort Missoula in the coming years will be centrally located to a vast population which will now live here. In that capacity, with its size and attributes, it could be the only so-called district park that Missoula could ever have. District parks are defined as very large areas designed to accommodate diverse uses, and they are crucial to livability in heavily urbanized areas. Thank you.
Okay, the theory that we are continuing on is, having given an overview for these two areas, we've identified some very specific concerns that we think would have to come into any discussion of how we would integrate open space and affordable housing. And so we have some folks that have talked to some others and pulled together some discussion for us. So if we want to start with that, Howard, you're going to do the concept of limits to growth.
This is actually limits to growth and access to housing, which at first may seem to be somewhat contradictory, but I think they're very related. Firstly, what are limits to growth? I break them down into two categories, basically physical limits, the limit of our airshed to absorb our pollutants and toxics and so forth, and just our general activity, our aquifer and its ability to supply us with clean water to use. And the spatial limits, if we go outside and we look at this valley, we're very constrained by specific topographical features, mountains. We can't develop this place, say, as Madison, which, other than a lake on one side, can continue to grow towards Milwaukee or Chicago or wherever it chooses. And that's the kind of development that's happening all over the country. But in our valley here, we can't do that. Spatially and topographically, we're somewhat constrained. The other physical features which define our limits to growth include things like soils, wetlands, our basic conservation resources, flora, fauna, all of which are dependent on some open space and are limiting our growth so that those things can continue to coexist with us. There's also the constructed type of limits to growth, those that we create either by zoning, by subsidies, tax incentives, whatever. There are a lot of different ways that we can construct limits to growth once we figure out what is appropriate by way of limits to growth, how much we want to limit our actual growth. So how do we limit, or how do we ascertain, rather, the limits to growth? There's some efforts going on right now with the county trying to look at carrying capacity. And specifically, one of those projects is to identify conservation resources. What are the most threatened resources? Why are they the most threatened? How can we mitigate those threats? And the other side of that is to determine what is our actual water supply and what is our sewage treatment capacity at this point. The outcome of these studies will be somewhat to suggest what appropriate development incentives or what incentives would be appropriate to encourage development in certain areas and to limit development in others. And to protect conservation resources in some areas, we have to acknowledge that it's really essential that we're going to develop other areas and conservation resources will be lost in those other areas. Essentially, I look at it as a moving target, somewhat like sustainability, that as we do different things, the target moves. So we can ascertain our limits to growth through doing these carrying capacity studies, but they only tell us kind of our maximum limits, and that as we change our behavior, our carrying capacity of certain things change. A good example would be our airshed and the way we currently use motor vehicles and industry in this area. If we were to change the way we use motor vehicles, the fuels we use, go to electric or solar electric type vehicles, then the carrying capacity of this airshed for as it relates to the amount of vehicle traffic that we have will change. So, and I would essentially say that all of the features of limits to growth change as we change our human activity. So how does this inform our treatment of housing and the creation of positions or strategies on the part of the new party? I think that essentially the carrying capacity studies are kind of moving towards recommending things like design standards, clustering. You'll hear some about these options from other folks later. I think that we have to be creative in how we choose to limit growth. We have to be creative in how we encourage housing development, and particularly how we create and maintain access to housing for less advantaged or lower income people. And so there's a wide variety of subsidy programs that have in the past attempted to meet some of those needs. And they range on a continuum from almost fully subsidized, publicly owned public housing to subsidized private housing. And often we want to balk at subsidies. We think that somehow they are bad, and yet I think it's important to recognize that we all benefit from subsidies. Everyone who owns a home in one way or another is benefiting from, let's say, tax incentives or tax breaks as a result of that home ownership. And so, and we basically all benefit from subsidies. All of our public services and infrastructure could be considered to be subsidized. And it's the largest actual housing subsidy that exists is that for private home ownership. And so I don't think that shying away from subsidies is necessarily a good thing. We might look at ways that we can make them more creative. Essentially, we could look at the business of government as being, in part, the business of subsidizing certain types of development and certain social programs. So I want to discuss a little bit what two things are that we're doing locally to address these that aren't necessarily publicly or government-generated types of subsidy programs. They're things that we can do locally through public involvement. And if there's anything that the new party is really about, it is public involvement in political process and access to decision-making. Those two things that I'm going to talk about are community land trusts for housing and a rent-to-own component that could be put with a community land trust to make housing accessible on an ongoing basis and to increase our access to potential home ownership. The other essential thing about community land trusts are that they can basically accomplish both of our goals here, that being to develop affordable housing and to provide for open space. Community land trusts essentially work in a way where the community builds a trust which buys lands and housing, and the lands in particular are held in perpetuity for the community. So the land is only, or the housing is only bought once. The banks are only paid their interest once, and so it tends to suppress the rate of increase of the value of that property. And the other factor is that by taking the land out of the, say, the selling price of the house or the value of the house as for figuring its rental value means that in Missoula on that $90,000 house, the land under it might be worth $30,000 or $35,000. Well, that brings its potential sale price in a land trust configuration down to $65,000, something like that. Could even be less. What that does, of course, is it allows people to have much easier access to ownership. In the rental scenario, people can build equity, a small amount of equity, as they rent, and then have a chance potentially to buy, to have the down payment money to buy later on, either in the market at large or through the land trust. And so these are ways that people can come together, the community can come together, try and address this problem. Land trusts might sound somewhat complicated. There are over 100 of them in the U.S. now, so they're pretty well tested, and there's pretty good support for developing them. And it seems that there is an emerging interest in Missoula in developing a strong community land trust. Most of the existing ones are back east in the Northeast, where the housing crunch really hit first. And so I think that there are real good models for us to follow in the developing of community land trust. The rent-to-own component hasn't been a very big component elsewhere, but I think given the shortage of accessible, affordable rentals, that would be an appropriate thing for us to do here, and we could use that to leverage people's access or ability to be able to own housing. And the key thing I want to come back to as far as process is that most community land trusts have been community generated. They have an open participatory process in deciding what land and homes will be acquired and how they will be distributed to members. And that, to me, seems to be particularly in keeping with our efforts here with the new party.
Hi, I'm Renacine, and one of the questions that I hear come up pretty often in the office that I work at, I work with families looking for housing and families who are unable to attain housing. So I work daily with people who are looking in the rental market and are unable to find or are finding very high-priced rentals. And one of the questions I think when people's frustration level gets really high is they look to other communities and look to see what other efforts have proven fruitful for those communities. And so one of the questions that a lot of people ask me is what about rent control, or what about rent stabilization? You know, is this an effort that Missoula, could look at? Is this an alternative for our community? And in hearing that question, I had a lot of conception of what that might be, and I pictured New York City, and I'd always heard about rent control there. And so in this discussion, I looked into rent control and tried to dig up some history about rent control and to put together what the basic aspects are, because I think that rent control or rent stabilization is a very highly controversial issue. And we always hear that the advocates say that it protects the poor from paying too much, and the critics say that it results in abandoned housing and deterioration. And so I really wanted to look into it and see what the aspects really were, and how different communities have used this as one solution. What the difference between rent control and rent stabilization? Rent control is really the word that was used during the wars. And what happened was, during the wars, when there was a shortage of materials, there was going to be what was called an involuntary resource transfer, where there really wasn't an equity between supply and demand. And so there became emergency housing projects that basically they just stopped the rent with whatever level it was when we entered the war, and then there was slow raises in rents beyond after the war was over. And this was basically to protect the tenants from the obvious exploitations that could happen. Well, rent stabilization is a little bit different. It basically is a pretty broad term, which is basically any ordinance which regulates the rate at which rents for sitting tenants are allowed to rise. So basically it puts in some amount of control that the community has over saying how much the rents are going to rise. So when we're having a lot of problems with building housing, and because of existing maybe shortage of land or other kinds of issues that we see, that this really becomes one way for the community to have some control over, and some say over, what the rent is. Now, of course, you hear critics say, well, what about free enterprise? What about, it's my land, I can charge what I want? And so there's a lot of controversy within this issue. Some of the conditions, and I think why Missoula is really targeted right now to look at rent control, is that there's some basic conditions when rent control is enacted. And basically, when there's a high proportion of renters in the population, which we have, a high proportion of college or university students in the population, low vacancy rates, strong barriers to creating additional units, be it shortage of land or restrictive kind of zonings and ordinances, such as single-family ordinances and things like that, and when there's a high general price inflation. So you can see that Missoula really fits the criteria of a lot of other cities that have looked at rent stabilization. And so really, there's about 200 communities that have enacted rent stabilization since 1970, and presently 2.8 million rental housing units are covered by rent control, which is really 10% of the rental property that there is across the nation. So you can see that there really is a lot of rent stabilization that is going on. So the next thing that I wanted to look at was, well, what are the aspects of rent control? We hear about that there's all these different restrictions, and what does it really mean? And so there's really basically 7 aspects to rent control. And they really vary from very stringent ordinances to very temperate ordinances. And when you start to look into them, different communities have really addressed different issues by how strict or how lenient they are within the 7 different aspects. The first one is general exemptions. One thing that they look into is seeing if there's only a few units held by one person, or if there's only a few units in a cluster, to say, well, maybe that should be exempt. And of course, stringent ordinances would have very few exemptions, and more temperate ordinances would have many more kinds of exemptions. The second thing would be exemptions for new construction. Almost all of the existing rent control does have some amount of exemptions for new construction, and the strict to temperate is kind of looking at how much they violate what they say they're going to do. So do they really let it be exempt, or do in 5 years do they say, okay, no more exemption for you? So that's where you can kind of see the scale run from. The next thing is vacancy decontrol, and that's basically when someone moves out of a unit that you see that the rent is brought up to market rate. And that's really variable. It just depends upon if there's a board and who regulates what the rent is going to be. Do you bring it up to a market rate, and how do you figure out what that rate is going to be, and who figures in on that? And that really varies in most communities, from being a city council that makes that kind of decision to a special board that is set up of community members, tenants, and landlords who together decide and get community input to look into what kind of market rate there should be, and looking at inflation and looking in that specific community to say, what kind of rent raising there should be. And so that's really moves into the 4th issue, which is provisions for determining allowable rent increases. And again, that's having some way of having community involvement in what rents should be paid. The next thing is the passing through costs of capital improvements. And we all hear about New York City and hear about how, they hurt their own property so that they can raise the rent, so that, they can get back the money that they put into the property. And you hear about all the fraudulent things that go on. But a lot of communities and a lot of the modern rent stabilization has really looked at this and tried to address this issue. And different ordinances say different things, from requiring owners to petition and work with the tenants, so that the landlord has to go to the tenants, talk to the tenants, and then they approach a board who would look and see and make more of the decision would be made not just with the landlord or not just with the tenant, but that there would be some kind of group decision and group process for those kinds of capital improvements. The next is passing through for hardship expenses. And that's basically looking at other kinds of operating expenses, and basically looks at the capital that the landlord is making off the property. And if they're not making enough of a profit, looking to see if they should be able to charge more rent. And again, who controls that is very variable. And the last thing is condominium conversions. One of the ways that in the early days that a lot of people got out of having rent control in their units was to turn them into condominiums. And so there's some real restrictions about what can happen to your housing. And that can be from anything from looking into condominium conversions or just simply, you can't just take the housing off the market either. You can't just sell the housing, that once it's rental, it has to stay rental. And so there's a lot of flexibility within that aspect as to how much control the landlord has and how much control the city has over those kinds of things. So as you can see, there's a lot of issues that go on within rent stabilization, and you can see how people could have very opinionated views about who it's going to help and who it's going to hurt. And I think that some of the issues that we hear a lot is does it really help the poor? Does it really help? Does it help everyone? Does it help middle-income people? And is that a bad thing? And I think there's a lot of discussion that does go on within that, and questions about whether or not it fights poverty. And I think one of the hardest aspects about really judging rent stabilization and whether or not it's effective is that it's really difficult to measure the effects that rent stabilization has had, because all of the studies we have now study the old forms of rent control, and they haven't studied the newer models of rent stabilization. So a lot of communities have really come up with really progressive, such as Santa Monica, which is a community of 90,000, and they've really come up with some real interesting ways of addressing addressing the issues of the community, because what they were finding was that people were being completely priced out, and that low-income people were having to commute in, and so then you start to have all the traffic problems, and then you start to have all these other issues, and you start to have ghettoizing, and there's all these other issues that came into play, and they really found that rent stabilization in their community was one way that they had to gain back some control. And so I think that's really important. And again, it all depends on locality and residents and housing availability and things like that. So there's a lot of concerns when we say rent stabilization, and a lot of fear that it's taking money from the owner and giving it to the tenant. And basically, the universal conclusion is that rent controls do indeed keep rents measurably below the levels they would have otherwise attained. So that's the only universal thing that we could find to say about rent stabilization, is that yes, it does keep rents lower, and of course there's the advocates, and there are the people who do not believe it's a good thing. But really, when we look at rent stabilization, the one thing we do have to keep in mind is that it's not a complete housing policy. This isn't something that we can just smack on and say, okay, Missoula, here you go, we've got some rent stabilization. There's a lot of other really important issues that we need to look at, and I think that it's really important that we have a full housing policy, such as looking at development, looking at affordability, and looking at a lot of other issues and a lot of things that are being brought up here today. But it is one thing that can help and lower rents, and one thing that I really believe that people might be interested in looking into and seeing how it might affect our community.
My name is Lynn Smith, and I come to this new party endeavor more from an open space perspective initially, but getting educated into why it's important to pay attention to all these affordable housing issues that are coming up. So I'm supposed to be talking a little bit about the specific ways that a community can address open space designation to preserve it. And because open space means so many different things to so many different people, and because we have such a tendency to take our surroundings for granted, I think there's a lot we don't know about the open space that is around us. We don't know who owns it. We don't know what plans they have for either eventually developing it or leaving it undeveloped as open space. This ownership can take usually the form of a private ownership, but it can be public or some mix of the two. And because Montana was slow to adopt subdivision regulations, many of these lands that now appear to be open space are basically already subdivided, and they will not remain as open space. And there has been little consideration for the open space values that should be figured in before their development occurs, primarily having to do with water, where it comes from and where it's stored and where it goes, and what soils are suitable, what existing land use patterns are important to the community and to the preservation of wildlife habitat, where the migration corridors are, what vegetation is critical to certain species, what native plants are in need of protection. We're just beginning to be able to gather this info and put it together and analyze it in layers, like Howard was talking about this carrying capacity study the county is doing. I think it's incredibly important, but I don't think we can wait till we have all the conclusions in place. Some very important questions, I think, are who is making the land use decisions and how are they being made? So far, I think it's perhaps been somewhat haphazard and not as well planned as it might be for a variety of interests. And some of the mechanisms that have been developed in a quest to balance private and public interests in how we approach open space and affordable housing, I was just going to briefly cover. One of them is zoning. Zoning is based, of course, on a community's giving direction to what it wants to become by shaping the design and development of its comprehensive plan. The public's interest in its natural surroundings must join with the private property interest in development in such a way that private property owners take the public's interest into consideration when deciding when and how to develop private property. These interests are not necessarily mutually exclusive. And then I was going to elaborate a little more on clustering, which has already been brought up. It's a very important and timely way for Missoula to put together its interest in affordable housing and open space would be to adopt creative zoning standards to cluster houses on smaller acreages. Recently, I was given some information on a multifamily townhouse development in Bozeman consisting of 75 3 to 4 bedroom, spacious, well-constructed homes on 9+ acres. I was really amazed. What makes this development work so well for both housing and open space is its staggered construction, so that although there is a common wall, say for 4 to 8 homes, it is staggered so that people have privacy in their backyards and their gardens. There are common areas of flowering trees, creek running through it, but no fences. And instead of putting a single house on a quarter or a half acre lot so that the 9+ acres could have supported only 18 to 36 houses, in this cluster development, 75 families share these 9+ acres with a very high quality of surrounding open space. By consuming less land for housing, less pressure is placed on the surrounding natural environment. And also there's a provision that each townhouse owner plans the inside of the house so that cost savings should be possible to allow for more affordable housing. In Missoula, we're in the process of having a townhouse subdivision built on Deanstone Mountain called Mansion Heights. It was initially proposed some 10 years ago and was considered innovative at the time. Unfortunately, instead of clustering in groups larger than 2, the townhouses are being spread over the face of the mountain. The developer's concept of open space is the cumulative area of all the backyards. In fact, Mansion Heights will not be a partnership between a private developer and the community to preserve open space and provide affordable housing. Another mechanism for helping open space and affordable housing happen together is transferring development rights. A landowner whose land is more suitable for development and who is compensated by that development could enter into an agreement with another landowner whose land is better suited for open space and who would decide not to develop the land and preserve it as open space, and in return would receive some portion of that compensation. The kind of partnership could be done on either, again, a private or a public basis or some combination of the two. Another mechanism, we could choose to pass another conservation bond as is being proposed, like we did in 1980, to acquire some other additional significant areas along the riverfronts and on the hillsides. I'm glad some people had the foresight to make that happen when it did, because it would cost a whole lot more now. And one example, I know the Northside Neighborhood Association would really like to see some protection for Waterworks Hill, like we have protection for the face of Sentinel now. It's now an easement form on the face of Sentinel, which was acquired by that original conservation bond. Easements are flexible agreements drawn up between landowners and land trusts or government bodies to restrict development in certain areas, often with some form of compensation in the form of a tax break. And they can also very much assist agricultural land in staying agricultural. And Howard has already really elaborated land trusts, so I won't really say much about that, other than there are ways of having land trusts that work for preserving open space, that work together with land trusts that are making affordable housing possible. So how do we put it all together? From a new party perspective, we create meaningful public processes, as we've already said, whose outcomes are respected for what emerges. We don't know what's going to happen in these public processes. They would be used to determine the public interest in combining affordable housing while preserving open space. We believe private property owners and developers are part of this community and can initiate development that incorporates the public's interests in its natural surroundings and affordable housing, we need to form partnerships that hold those with greater means accountable to the rest of the community to create the kind of place we all want to live in.
I'm Linda Tracy, and I am really going to have a hard time up here because I talk with my hands, and I've got two things to hold on to, so this is going to be tough. I have been asked to talk about some of the livability issues that straddle housing and open space, and for me that comes down to a lot of the concept, the role that transportation plays in the relationship between housing and open space. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what's happening now and its impacts on our livability or our quality of life in our community, and some visions for the future. Right now, as you look around Missoula, those of you who've lived in Missoula for decades, and I know a couple of you have that I see in the audience, you've seen how we've begun to build housing and urban subdivisions further and further away from community centers, where land costs and restrictions are less and where we have more open space to build in. This has impacted our quality of life in a number of ways. One is that it's made it more expensive for all of us to live. The further away that you live from where you need to go, and the more it costs you to get back and forth. Think of all the places that you travel in the course of any given week, whether it's to work or to school or to the grocery store, visiting friends and other family, to the post office, to this kind of a meeting tonight. Think of how much it costs you to drive your car or to take the bus or to ride your bike or walk. Certainly with bicycling and walking, that cost may also not just be a monetary cost, but may also be a time cost. In terms of looking at how much it really does cost our community and cost you as individuals, all of us as individuals, to live further and further away from the kinds of places that we need to go, there's been a recent study that just released some results that found that it costs us each about $5,000 to $7,000 a year just to operate a motor vehicle. That includes costs like taxes and licensing and registration, gas and oil, parking, insurance, repair, and those kinds of things, as well as depreciation. And then when you consider the cost of having to have more than one vehicle in a home for each adult that has an independent lifestyle, you add up significantly more costs. Last night I was talking to Jim McGrath, a new member of the Bicycle Pedestrian Advisory Board. He was relating to me an experience that he had while living in Dallas, Texas. He found that by moving 17 miles outside of Dallas, he could find a more affordable home. If he were to live closer to his job, he could find a home, but it would cost him more. The cost that he ended up bearing was a lower rent, but he ended up carrying that cost in his transportation. And for Jim, that meant that he would ride his bicycle 17 miles each way to and from work. But that was still a sizable commitment of cost on his part, the cost of his time. Certainly, people who live in mobile homes or manufactured housing here in our community find themselves often more on the outskirts of town or outside of our city limits, and that significantly adds to their commuting time or their transportation costs. I know there's someone in this room who walks quite a great deal of distance to get from her home up in Travoi to her place of work out on East Broadway each day, both ways. Sprawling development also adds to traffic congestion. The further away any of us live from our destinations, the more trips we must take and the more miles we must travel. In Missoula, some of you may have heard this statistic before, we travel already over 1 million miles each day. Nationally, in comparing 1990 with 1960, we have twice as many cars in our country, and we're traveling 3 times as many miles as we used to in 1960. And we make 80 to 90% of these trips alone in our cars. Air quality also suffers as we have more cars being driven further and being driven more often. Open space also suffers as we dedicate more land to sprawling development. Open spaces close to the urban core are lost to development. We lose more space to parking lots and other places to store cars. We lose land even more land as we need wider roads and new roads to be developed to carry the additional capacity and this additional demand. We also lose in terms of our neighborhood and community life. I see bicycling and walking as an indicator species of how livable our communities are, and ask the questions, can you walk around your neighborhood? Is there a place for you to walk around your neighborhood? Can you get to any essential services? Could you go down and pick up a quart of milk or a stick of butter by walking or taking your bike? Or do you have to get in the car? Is that the only way that you have to get there? Do you know your neighbors? Are there places for your children to play? How much traffic is there in your neighborhood and how fast is it traveling? We in Missoula are now much less likely to ride a bicycle or walk now than we were 10 years ago. The census data is showing us that 14% of us used to walk to work in 1980. Now only 4% of us are able to do so. And that's a strong concern. Nationwide, the trend is the same. We've lost over 1 million fewer people walking to work now than 10 years ago. And all of this coupled with not only have we created an environment that's more difficult to walk in, we've created an environment where people are further away from where they need to go to work, to shop, to school. But we also have in our community a situation where 10% of our households do not have a car, do not have access to a motor vehicle. And 30% of our population do not drive. They are children, there are some disabled folks, there are some seniors, there are people who cannot otherwise drive or do not choose to drive or cannot afford to drive. So the vision that I'd like to leave you with tonight is one of a Missoula where a mix of housing types and developments are clustered together, where you can buy a gallon of milk in your neighborhood store within just a few minutes of walk, where you can get around Missoula easily and efficiently without a car. And actually, in thinking about it and talking to a few old-time Missoulians, I learned that this is a picture of Missoula back closer to the turn of the century, up until the 1930s or so. I understand that's when the trolley went out. You used to be able to take a trolley from East Missoula and ride all over the city and be able to get back and forth to your destinations. What it takes is a coordinated land use for housing and open space with transportation planning, with centralized density, some of the examples like the one that Lynn gave in Bozeman, where you have clustered development, the concept of even urban growth boundaries as they have in Oregon, or the green belts that were established in England around towns and villages back in the 1580s under Elizabeth I. Infill development in existing neighborhoods. Compare what you know or what you've seen of pictures or of movies that may have been set in European cities with television programs or movies you may have seen set in Phoenix or Houston, with how livable those kinds of communities are. Where would you prefer to live? In a more vibrant community where there's a lot happening, where there's a lot more density, or a community that's much more of a concrete jungle where you need to have a motor vehicle to get around? A place that is a contrast with strip developments, high crime rates, car crashes, smog. Again, as Lynn said earlier, cluster development leaves less land or uses less land and leaves more open for parks, for ball fields, for habitat, for the mountain views, the kinds of open space that Bill was talking about earlier. Multi-use development is another concept that mixes recreation, something called convenience retail, where you used to be able to go down and find the tailor on the corner, the dry cleaner on the corner, the soda fountain on the corner, the place where you used to go down to be able to get that gallon of milk at the neighborhood little grocery store, with residential, with housing. I looked to the Orange Street travel mall that was just opened up on Orange Street, just off the interstate, and I decry the loss of an opportunity for some housing above those shops, and some better design perhaps. So the concept here that I'm looking at is the role that transportation does play in housing, in creating housing that is more affordable by bringing it in closer, by clustering it closer together, by having a mixture of uses in close proximity that creates community centers. At the same time, leaving space for the critical open space that we all need. Thank you.
Well, that took us a little longer than we thought. But not too bad, not too bad, because basically what we've been trying to do is to give you a sense of where our thinking has taken us. That these are the kinds of issues that we think have to come into a program that would be taken forward in this kind of integration of open space and affordable housing. What we'd like to do now is invite you to add to our thoughts here. We've told you where we have been. We've told you some of the emerging solutions that we're beginning to have. If there's some things that you would like to add, if there's some patterns you see here, if there are some contrasts you'd like to make, we'd like to get them up here again, because as I say, we're going to take this as a first step on to something else. So we'd like to spend at least 20 minutes doing that. So we'd ask each of you that are going to do it to be fairly succinct, and at the last 10 minutes we're going to do kind of a wrap-up of where we go from here. So I have my microphone person here. Again, so that folks that are watching us on MCAT can hear what you're going to say, we're going to ask you to speak in this microphone, and Howard and I will be trying to capture what you're saying up on our lists as well. So I invite your comment, your connections, whatever it is that you would care, a question. We have some time here, so let's open it up and see who'd like to give us a succinct comment or whatever.
I'm Mary Bouchard, and then the one thing I think that we need to talk about is, as I said, manufactured housing. Manufactured house does not have to be a trailer and a low-class home. It can be a nice house, and a lot of times can look a lot nicer than a lot of the stick homes around. And I think that we need to look into some kind of zoning law or something that can open up land for manufactured housing. Thank you. I'm Perry LaCour. I don't know if many of you probably know that I'm really into sewering. Sewering plays into a lot of what you're bringing up here. And there again, sewering regulations and the impact that it would have on affordable housing, open space, and growth management. All three of those issues can be confronted with a good sewering proposal. And although sewering existing residents may not adversely impact open space, the extension of sewers into outlying areas will cause a loss of open space areas, or open space. We're very concerned about the effects of such continued sewering on both air quality as well as open space, and it does impact both of those. We have been actively working on obtaining information from all over the western United States on how other communities implement and pay for their sewering projects. The highest price that I have been able to obtain thus far has been $6,500. That's for everything. That's an on-site hookup. Interestingly, I found an area that was forced onto a sewer just recently that is in a county, and they're retrofitting of the gravity and retrofitting, I guess I should have defined that. Retrofit are homes that are on septics, which are refitted with gravity sewers. Their total price for this sewering is less than $2,900. So what I'm saying in this is that when we're looking at these two major issues, and also growth management, which is another area that we all need to be concerned in, sewering plays or can play a very vital role in controlling all three of those factions. I'd like to close with just saying we're all in this together. The solutions need to meet the needs of all the Missoulians and not just the select few. Thank you.
I would like to elaborate a little more on what I said. By the way, I belong to the New Party, too. There is a need, a very definite need in the community and a lot of communities for not-for-profit nursing complexes. The laws and regulations that regulate nursing complexes today are very loose and lax, and the operators, the entrepreneurs, are reaping a harvest at the expense of the taxpayers and the people who are forced to retire to these complexes. And there's a good chance that a lot of us will end up there. As an example, how it costs the taxpayers, there is one organization that owns 3 complexes in this community. They took $4+ million net profit out of this community 2 years ago. That money didn't stay in Montana. They made their profits at the expense of the working people. In other words, their basic wage was $4.38 an hour. Therefore, the people who worked for them had to resort to food stamps and Medicaid. And even then, they couldn't make it. The turnover is high. The personnel per numbers of peoples in the nursing complexes is extremely high, and the care is not really good. And that is why we need, as a community, to address this issue. There's one man in the community here who has said he will donate $10,000 to either a nursing home complex, not-for-profit custodial home, group home, or we could even have, what are those expensive housing complexes we have to avoid rent control? She mentioned it. What was it you mentioned? Pardon me? Condominium-type nursing complexes. I'm just starting on this, and so anybody that knows anything about it or would like to tell me about it, I would be interested. I know it's going to be a long haul, because when you start anything like this, you're up against the industry. Thank you.
My name is Joseph Halderson. I would suggest one of the first steps that you need to do if you're planning on building new houses, you obviously have to have sewer systems to go with it. And along with that, what you need to do is to follow Public Law 91-190 and use a systematic interdisciplinary approach for the design of the sewer system to take care of whatever you're building. Thank you. And also, I might add, if you don't do that, then there's an open area for fraud, which I'm presently exposing at this time. Thank you.
Hi, Andy Sponsoller from Save Open Space. I just wanted to make a comment in regards to community land trusts for affordable housing. I think that in the future, if in fact we choose to pursue this route, that we need to be creative and ever vigilant in looking for possible properties to supply an inventory for community land trust. I think Fort Missoula and the foundation land would have been a good opportunity for something like that. It's been verbalized by the Save the Fort people that in order to meet the foundation's financial needs for funding approximately 2 scholarships per year, they need approximately $12,500 per year to offset what would be the interest money from the $450,000 that was the purchase price of the land. Community Land Trust could come up with a creative approach to supply that $12,500 a year, and could have, if it had been Johnny on the spot, possibly brokered a deal with the foundation to secure that land for affordable housing. Had they been there to do that and had some sort of a scheme to develop $12,500 a year to secure a piece of land which would have provided a very large amount of housing. So I think that it's really important for us to get intelligent and smart about creative solutions to funding, or not funding, but supplying that stock of land to a community land trust. And I think things like this are things we need to look out for in the future.
I'm Will Snodgrass, founder and spokesperson for Missoulians for Clean Environment. And this afternoon I visited with some people in affordable housing off Russell Street. These are the new glue-up plastic homes which are being provided at about $400 per month. Now many of these people are being forced to move out of this housing because it's unfit for them to live in. It looks very nice, it's clean. However, the off-gassing from the building materials and the building adhesives are causing rashes on the skin of the children. These people are becoming very ill. It's severe enough that the news people who were in there today doing a story on this came out of there with their eyes burning, their skin was itching, and they were having problems breathing. So it's one thing to build shelter for people, but it's another thing to build shelter that is making people sick. Now this is not a new problem. This is happening all over the United States. Of course, in these lower income affordable housing units, we're not putting in natural wool carpeting. We're putting in lower cost carpeting, which is making these people sick. It has styrene butadiene in it. We have high levels of formaldehyde in there. And it really troubles me that a person moves in with high expectations into a new home and then is forced to seek housing out in Rock Creek or to try to find a home that's about 30 years old that doesn't have these types of problems. This is going to get worse among our population as this type of housing begins to predominate. We also have the problem of denial, I believe, in this community regarding what is really happening here. I think it's very clear to me, in my own mind, and I'm sure in the minds of many others, that those of us who do not have a lot of money are being forced to move out by the increase in taxes, by the influx of people who have more money than we have, people who are leaving areas which are suffering degradation. So we're being forced out, and there are forces in the community, developers, etc., who are more than willing to trade off our interests for the more moneyed interests of those moving in. And then in closing, as the population of this valley begins to increase greatly due to the influx of people fleeing the decaying inner cities, and the increase in traffic, given the geography of this community and given what we knew in 1963, what our physicians told us in 1963, that the valley had already then, 30 years ago, reached carrying capacity. Knowing all of those things, the future for Missoula does pose some very, very serious challenges, and I think one of the greatest challenges that we face is denial of what is happening here. This is a very, very challenging era for us right now, and I think we have to take a long, hard look at our lifestyles, at our homes, at our transportation system. Thank you.
I have a concern as I've been in Missoula for about 5 years now, and finding housing that's accessible to people with disabilities is extremely difficult in most areas of the country, and probably more so here because of the concentration of older homes, except for the last couple of years when the building boom has really hit. I just got some updated statistics from the Housing Task Force, and as of December 1993, the average home price in Missoula was $101,000, which is gone up substantially just in the past year. The housing prices have gone up about 1% a month, and if you can't find an older home that can be easily retrofitted to be made accessible, the only choice that you have is to build a new home. And we were told about a year ago when we talked to a realtor that the cost at that point was about $95,000 was entry level for building a new home. So I just would suggest that if we're looking at these concepts such as cluster housing, manufactured housing, I would just kind of let people know that manufactured housing is notoriously inaccessible, and that I'm not sure if there are any manufacturers that are trying to make accessible housing. And I think that it's really good for us to bear in this mind a concept that I've learned in the last few years called the home for life. And it recognizes the fact that we're all going to get old someday if we don't die first, and that we're going to need some accessibility features. And it's really wise for people to build those into their homes, whether they think they're going to need them or not. They will eventually, number one. And number two, they may get to be friends with somebody with a disability who might just want to come visit them. So I think that's something to bear in mind as we start to look at especially single-family homes, which accessibility gets lost in the shuffle almost all of the time. So thanks.
Hi, I'm Gail Gucci, and I live in House District 67, and I am among those people who now spends more than 30% of her income paying rent. And in that district, 59% of the people who live there are renters. And so I'm interested in hearing more about the rent stabilization and what that's about and how that comes about, if that's a legislative decision or a city or how that works. And I wanted to thank you all for putting this on. I thought it was really informational and full of really good ideas.
I'm Mike Kennedy, and my first observations of housing in Missoula go back to the late 40s when Montana was really a union state, and incomes were reasonable, and the number of people on what was called a so-called minimum income, they ranged less than 10% of the population or the workforce. And in Missoula right now, that's about 45%. And interestingly, the average rent in Missoula is about $600 a month, and the average income for rent, of course, is around $13,000. And it doesn't take a scientist to figure out that when you're paying more than 50% of your income for rent, there's something that's not okay about that. I believe that when we attract industry into this community that continues to suck capital out of the community and pay people at minimum wage at minimum wage, and not provide benefits, is a source of many of these problems. And it requires us as a community, all together, the industry, the developers, the agricultural people, students, everyone, to pursue a new way of being that will create an environment so that we can begin to solve these problems. Again, we can't get into the same car with the same driver and drive down the same road and arrive at a different place. We have got to make some changes in the way we structure our lives and the way we are. And if we do that and take personal responsibility, it is my belief that we can emerge from this mire that we're in right now. The other night I talked to a woman who lived in East Missoula, and her income was around $16,000. And she had 2 small children, and she said something to me that really did touch me, and it talked about how this change in being can come about. And I asked her the question how much she would pay for open space. And I won't go into the details of that, but what she said to me was open space can be equated to public health. And I said, yes, that's the kind of being that we need to look at, because we're in this again all together, every one of us, and the taking care of each other is what it's about. And providing decent income and decent housing for people is what it's about. And we can do this. It is possible, and we have energy to do it, and we need to resource that energy.
Just to answer quickly your question about rent stabilization, again, I think that there's a lot of issues within the rent stabilization question that really need to be addressed, and to really look at something that would really benefit our community. And a lot of the materials that I have on the back table, I have one of the most unbiased articles I could find was put out by City Limits, and there's a 5-page article on the back table there. There's also a few other a few other articles. There's one really good article about why rent stabilization would be really important with mobile homes, and part of that would be because of the unique situation that mobile homeowners are in, because they're really not mobile, they're actually manufactured. And so as you can see with a lot of, we have a 0 vacancy rate for mobile home lots in Missoula, and we've, as you see with sewer failure and other things like that, that there is, that this is really a unique issue, and that rent stabilization would really offer mobile homeowners a way to have more control over their situation, because pretty much they have to pay any rent increase that comes up, because they don't have the mobility that that some of us who are renters do. So I really can see that could be a real viable way that rent stabilization could start off. But basically, both at the city and county level, there first needs to be petitions circulated by voters. And so at the city level, rent control could be adopted by city council, but again, there has to be the whole petition aspect, and then it would have to be placed before city voters to be able to vote for or against. And so there's a lot of steps there in the process. And at the county level, it might require enabling some kind of legislation from the state legislature. And there are 12 to 20 states, somewhere in there, that actually have rent stabilization illegal, but Montana is not one of them, luckily. And the other thing is that under any scenario, what most people have found when they've started to look into rent stabilization is that you will definitely encounter a well-financed and very organized opposition from both real estates and landlords. And so that's something that unfortunately the process gets, that you need to think about looking into rent stabilization, is that there'd really have to be some people deciding that they really want to organize around that issue, and to pull a lot of community support around that issue. So that's kind of the steps briefly.
Was there one more comment or question, and we're going to go toward a last sort of...
Yes, again, my name is John Rice. I'm the regional coordinator for Montana's for Better Government. I think you can see here this evening that many of us are concerned about the high cost of sewering, which affects affordable housing and can diminish open space with sewer offering high density. Some of us believe sewering is needed, but not in all areas of the community, and not when our sewage treatment plant is the largest polluter of the Clark Fork River. I am currently conducting an investigation into the legitimacy of sewering in Missoula, and we would appreciate any input from the community. Thank you.
Linda had some problem because she talks with her hands. I've got both of my hands tied up now because I talk with my hands with notes. So this is tough. My name is Bill Chalupka. I am a new party member, and I teach political science at the University of Montana, and I've been asked to provide some summary for this, and I'm actually going to try to do that. And I was sort of sitting there arguing with myself for most of the meeting here. I felt about like those folks must have felt announcing that basketball game on Monday night. I said, when that thing's over, how can anybody say anything about it? It was such an astonishing thing, you just have to re-roll the tape. Well, that'll evidently be possible here also. But I'm not going to propose that either. The first thing I want to do is to ask all of us to give a round of applause for the speakers, who I just think did a great job, and also for all the people who made statements and comments out here in the audience. How about a round of applause? And then, since applause ought to always be symmetrical, how about a round of applause for all the folks who came out tonight? I'm sure there were better things to do. The comments that I want to make, and I think you could, it's obviously clear that you could keep talking about this situation forever. I want to make just some brief comments by way of wrapping it up. First of all, I think for me, the greatest frustration of the meeting is that we had a lot of people come interested in the sewering issue, and we heard about that, but but I was frustrated by the fact that our format wasn't really set up to have a good back and forth and really for us to learn from each other. So I really hope that we can find other ways, perhaps through the working group that Judy mentioned, or perhaps in some other way that we can have an interaction here, because clearly, and the new party includes folks who are very concerned about non-single point groundwater pollution. There's no doubt about it. But I think we're also very concerned about issues of affordability. That's my one frustration from the meeting, is that I don't think we really had a meeting of minds on that one. And I really appreciate you coming, and I really want to, perhaps a little presumptuously, speak on behalf of the other new party folks here and say that we need to figure out some way that we can talk in a more direct way on this one. Past that, that's really about the only frustration. I was quite struck by, I think, a sense that a lot of people had thought a lot about this issue and were sensitive to the other side. One of the questions I was asked to address here in closing is, why a political party? And I think tonight we've seen a really good example of that. If I'm not mistaken, it was Judy that mentioned the process of deliberation earlier in the evening, if I caught that right. And I think that's what you've seen here tonight. We've got people in the new party who are more interested in open space than they are in affordable housing, and vice versa. We've got people more interested in affordable housing than in open space. But I think what you've seen tonight is folks saying, here's my position, here's what I think's important, and here are some ways in which I think we can bridge that gap. I must say, just for myself, and I hope I'm not being too presumptuous or cantankerous here, but I think tonight is the first meeting that I can ever remember being to in Missoula where I really did not feel that open space was being used as a code word for no more growth ever anywhere. And I think that's a development. I think the people who organized this forum really can take great credit for that. I think it works the other way around as well. I think the affordability and rent control are being offered here not as signs of anger or upset, but as part of a whole package and process of moving forward. And I hope I'm not characterizing the proceedings too much by describing them that way, but that's really what I saw. To be more specific, just very briefly, let me try this impossible task of summarizing. I've got one comment of something that I did not hear tonight, and of course, there's a lot of things I'd like to talk about, but I think of all the things that I was thinking of, there's one thing that I think is crucial for us to remind ourselves about. We are not yet in a situation where either the loss of open space or the loss of affordability is an inevitable and permanent situation in Missoula. And I think maybe nobody said it because it was implied in everybody's comments. Everybody was so optimistic and willing to work and hope, and basically hopeful that maybe it didn't need to be said. There are communities in the United States, in this region, where affordable housing is a lost goal, that it's just never going to happen again. Incomes have risen so much, real estate values have risen so much, bad decisions have been made on various kinds of growth control, and there's just never going to be affordability. There's only going to be ghettoizing and people having to drive long distances to work in those communities. There are other communities, obviously, this is the more common situation and the one we're more familiar with, where the chances for open space are gone. Phoenix was mentioned, a sprawling big city with almost no open space, unless you count the space between the curbs, which is, I suppose, open on occasion, in between lights. I think it's my view that neither of these situations are permanently closed yet in Missoula. I think we need to keep reminding ourselves that both of those both of those are the case. Brief summary. First of all, number one, what I heard was lots of innovative, if partial, steps that would ease the situation that stands between these two positions. And I think that's important. And I think what we've got lots of ways to symbolize that there are ways to bridge the gap, and ways to bridge the gap in partial ways, whether it be the land trusts on the one side or the small open spaces on the other side that were mentioned. I think it's important for us to think about the problem as one that can be bridged, and to be continually presenting suggestions that will help bridge it. In themselves, none of those smaller measures will solve the problem, but they will symbolize the solution, and they'll give us a chance to move in that direction, and they'll give us a chance to fight off some of that pessimism and absolutism that sometimes characterizes the issue, I think. Second thing that I saw here, and again to follow up on Judy, as her remarks were so good at setting the tone, I think we did indeed see some will to lead here. I mean, I hope you were all listening carefully, and I heard well-known open space advocates in this town say we're going to have to build some houses. And I heard well-known advocates for the environment in this town saying there's going to have to be density, and density is a good thing. I heard affordability advocates say rents. We know how tough rent stabilization is. In other words, I heard people, even though it wasn't really a discussion format or a debate format evening, I heard people saying there's some distance that I'm willing to go, and I see that this is something that's going to have to be assembled through many different parts and many different positions. I think I'll leave it there, as I'm getting the cutoff sign that we're nearing our 2 hours on MCAT. But thanks again for being here. Was there somebody else who wanted to talk here before we get off? Very quickly, I think we'll sign this off.
Oh, okay. Actually, this is for the people that are here. There are coffee and cookies outside. There is information about the new party in the back. We invite you to join us if you were interested in what happened tonight and being part of a process with us. You can find out more in the back. And Linda wanted to there is a discussion of the carrying capacity study that's going to happen at the neighborhood association that I belong to, and that's over at Roosevelt School on the third Wednesday. Now, that would be, someone know which is the third Wednesday? At 7 o'clock. Anyway, if you're the 20th at Roosevelt School, 7 o'clock for that, 7:15, from that oft-mentioned carrying capacity study. You're all invited, and Linda had one announcement to end us with.
One of the things that Judy had spoken about earlier was this concept of the family definition in Missoula's zoning ordinance, and there's a group of people who've been meeting with a subcommittee from the City Council to look at this issue. We will be having another meeting bright and early tomorrow morning at 7:45 in the morning in the City Council conference room, where we will be talking about or brainstorming about the alternatives. We've gone through a process of identifying the parameters of the issue, identifying some common ground, looking at the balance between providing peaceful, quiet, family-supportive neighborhoods and the need for people to find places to live and be able to stay and live in their homes. And so we invite you to come join us tomorrow morning at 7:15 if you are awake. And good night. Thank you. 7:45 a.m.